Did you know that over 35,000 people are homeless in Canada on any given night? That number is staggering. But here's the truth. It's likely much higher. Many individuals living on the streets or in shelters go uncounted, leaving us with a much darker picture than the statistics reveal. Homelessness isn't just an issue in major cities like Toronto or Vancouver. It's spreading into suburban areas and smaller cities across the country. From skyrocketing housing costs to systemic failures, the reasons behind this crisis are complex and deeply troubling. Today, we'll explore the top 10 cities most affected by homelessness in Canada. Starting with two you may not expect. Victoria, British Columbia, often praised for its mild climate and picturesque landscapes, might seem like an unlikely place for a homelessness crisis. Yet, with a population under 400,000, over 1,500 people in Victoria are currently homeless, and that number has been steadily rising. What makes this issue even more striking is that many of these individuals are forced to live outdoors, in parks, or under bridges. Despite the city's moderate weather compared to other parts of Canada, these conditions can still be deadly. The root of the crisis lies in Victoria's unaffordable housing market. While the city is less expensive than nearby Vancouver, it remains out of reach for many low-income residents. Mental health challenges and addiction issues further compound the problem, leaving local shelters overwhelmed and unable to meet the growing demand. Victoria is a sobering reminder that even smaller, seemingly prosperous cities are not immune to Canada's homelessness epidemic. Surrey, British Columbia, is another city facing a severe homelessness crisis. Often overshadowed by Vancouver, Surrey has seen its homeless population more than double in recent years, with over 800 people now without stable housing. This rapid increase is tied to the city's growing population and rising housing costs, which are forcing entire families into precarious living situations. Surrey's crisis is not just about housing. It's also about the lack of support for individuals struggling with mental health challenges and addiction. Emergency shelters are overcrowded, and resources are stretched thin, leaving many without access to the help they desperately need. Surrey highlights an important truth. Homelessness is no longer confined to major urban centers. It's spreading into suburban areas, where the infrastructure to address the problem is often even less prepared. This raises the pressing question: how long before the crisis reaches even more cities? Did you know that the homelessness crisis in Canada is not just confined to big cities like Toronto and Vancouver? Across the country, smaller cities and regions are grappling with a growing number of people without stable housing. What's even more shocking is how this crisis has silently crept into places many would never expect. From rising housing costs to inadequate mental health support, the causes are complex and deeply rooted. Today, we'll uncover the stories behind two cities, Halifax and Winnipeg, where the homelessness crisis is escalating at an alarming rate. Halifax, Nova Scotia, known for its historic charm, bustling waterfront, and close-knit community, might seem like an idyllic place. But beneath the surface, the city is facing a homelessness crisis that has rapidly worsened in recent years. With over 700 people now homeless, Halifax's shelters are overwhelmed, and the resources available fall woefully short of what's needed. The crisis is fueled by skyrocketing housing costs, which have surged in the past decade. While Halifax's housing market isn't as notorious as Toronto or Vancouver, its limited supply of affordable homes has left many residents, especially low-income earners, unable to find stable housing. For those living paycheck to paycheck, even a small financial setback can lead to homelessness. Mental health challenges and addiction further exacerbate the issue, with many individuals falling through the cracks of a social safety net that isn't equipped to handle the growing demand for support services. Adding to the challenge is Halifax's relatively small size and infrastructure. Limited public transportation and a lack of outreach services make it difficult for those in need to access resources or secure employment. Many homeless individuals are left to navigate a cycle of instability, moving between overcrowded shelters and temporary accommodations. For a city celebrated for its community spirit, it's heartbreaking to see so many people struggling to survive. While local organizations work tirelessly to provide aid, the crisis continues to grow, highlighting the urgent need for long-term solutions. Winnipeg, Manitoba, presents an even harsher reality. Known for its bone-chilling winters, the city's extreme weather makes homelessness particularly dangerous. With over 1,500 people currently homeless, Winnipeg faces unique challenges that go beyond housing affordability. For those living on the streets, winter temperatures that can plunge below -30 degrees Celsius are not just uncomfortable, they're life-threatening. Many individuals are forced to seek refuge in makeshift shelters, abandoned buildings, or even under bridges to escape the cold. Despite being one of Canada's more affordable cities, Winnipeg's homelessness crisis is driven by systemic issues like poverty, addiction, and mental health struggles. Indigenous communities are disproportionately affected, making up a significant portion of the homeless population. This reflects the ongoing impacts of colonialism, systemic racism, and a lack of targeted support for these communities. Many Indigenous individuals face barriers to stable housing and employment, leaving them vulnerable to the harsh realities of life without shelter. While the city provides emergency shelters during the winter, these spaces are often overcrowded, and the demand far exceeds the supply. For many, accessing these resources is also a challenge, as limited outreach programs and transportation options create additional hurdles. Organizations in Winnipeg are doing their best to support the homeless population, but the lack of long-term solutions means many continue to face dangerous and unstable conditions. Halifax and Winnipeg may be on opposite ends of the country, but they share a common struggle. Both cities are vivid examples of how homelessness is not just a problem for Canada's largest urban centers. It's a nationwide issue that requires urgent action, comprehensive strategies, and a commitment to supporting those who have been left behind. These stories remind us that the homelessness crisis is not just about numbers. It's about people, each with their own challenges, hopes, and need for dignity and compassion. Did you know that Canada's homelessness crisis isn't confined to the country's biggest cities? It's spreading across urban centers, small towns, and even suburban areas. What's even more alarming is that many of those affected are hidden from official statistics. Living in overcrowded shelters, couch surfing, or staying in unsafe conditions. This crisis is not just about housing. It's a symptom of deeper economic and social challenges. Today, we'll explore the homelessness crisis in two cities you might not expect: Ottawa and Edmonton. These stories will shed light on the urgent need for action and the human impact of this growing issue. Ottawa, Ontario, the nation's capital, is often associated with political power, wealth, and cultural vibrancy. Yet, beneath its polished surface, the city faces a growing homelessness crisis that is often overlooked. Over 1,000 people in Ottawa are currently homeless, a number that has risen sharply in recent years. What makes this even more concerning is the variety of people affected. From youth to veterans to families struggling to make ends meet, the rising cost of living in Ottawa is a major driver of the crisis. Despite being one of the most affluent cities in Canada, the combination of stagnant wages and increasing housing prices has left many residents unable to afford basic shelter. Even middle-income families are now just one paycheck away from homelessness. Youth homelessness has also become a pressing issue. with many young people fleeing abusive households or aging out of the foster care system without adequate support. Similarly, veterans, many of whom have served the country in times of war, are being left behind, struggling to access housing and services that address their unique needs. Ottawa's shelters are overcrowded, forcing some to wait weeks or even months for a spot in permanent housing. The city has made efforts to address the crisis, including partnerships with local organizations, but the demand for services far exceeds the available resources. Ottawa's situation is a stark reminder that even cities with significant resources and influence are not immune to the growing homelessness epidemic. For a city that represents the heart of the country, its inability to provide for its most vulnerable residents highlights the urgent need for systemic change. Moving west, Edmonton, Alberta, presents a different yet equally challenging picture. Known for its oil industry and cultural diversity, Edmonton has become one of the hardest hit cities by homelessness in Alberta, with over 2,000 people currently experiencing homelessness. The crisis here is deeply entrenched and growing. Edmonton's challenges are rooted in a mix of economic instability, a lack of affordable housing, and systemic barriers faced by marginalized communities. Alberta's reliance on the oil and gas industry has created a boom and bust cycle that leaves many vulnerable during economic downturns. When oil prices plummet, jobs are lost, and families that once had stable incomes find themselves unable to pay rent or mortgages. This economic instability has pushed many into poverty and, ultimately, homelessness. Compounding this issue is the lack of affordable housing in Edmonton, which disproportionately affects low-income families, single mothers, and Indigenous communities. Indigenous people, in particular, face systemic challenges, including racism, discrimination, and a lack of targeted support, which contribute to their overrepresentation in the homeless population. Edmonton's shelters are overwhelmed, and while the city has implemented programs to provide temporary relief, they fall short of addressing the root causes of the crisis. Families with young children are particularly vulnerable, often living in temporary accommodations with little hope for long-term solutions. For these families, homelessness is not just a lack of housing, it's a constant state of instability that affects every aspect of their lives. From education to health to emotional well-being, the rising homelessness crisis in Ottawa and Edmonton underscores the urgent need for a coordinated national strategy. These cities, despite their differences, are united by the growing number of people left without a place to call home. The stories of those affected highlight the deep human cost of this crisis. Families torn apart, individuals struggling to survive, and communities grappling with how to respond. As these numbers continue to grow, the question remains, how long can we wait before meaningful action is taken? These cities remind us that homelessness is not just a statistic, it's a call to action for all of us. Did you know that homelessness in Canada is not just a big city problem? The crisis has expanded far beyond places like Toronto and Vancouver, reaching cities that many would never expect to be affected so deeply. From economic instability to skyrocketing housing costs, the reasons behind this crisis are complex, and the impact is devastating. Today, we're focusing on two cities, Calgary and Montreal, where the homelessness crisis is growing at an alarming rate. These stories will not only surprise you but also reveal just how widespread and urgent this issue has become. Calgary, Alberta, often seen as a symbol of economic prosperity with its booming oil industry and modern skyline, is facing a homelessness crisis that's impossible to ignore. Despite its image as a wealthy city, over 3,000 people in Calgary are currently homeless, living on the streets or in temporary shelters. What makes Calgary's situation particularly troubling is that it's rooted in the city's economic Cycles. When oil prices are high, Calgary thrives. But when the market takes a downturn, the ripple effects are catastrophic for many families and individuals. The economic instability caused by the boom and bust nature of Alberta's oil industry has left countless people vulnerable. Stable jobs suddenly disappear, and with them go the ability to afford rent or mortgages. For many, losing a job means losing their home. Even those who manage to keep their homes are often one unexpected expense away from financial ruin. This has led to a growing number of people being pushed into homelessness, unable to keep up with the rising cost of living in the city. Calgary also faces significant challenges with youth and Indigenous homelessness. Many young people are fleeing abusive homes or struggling to find their footing after aging out of the foster care system. Indigenous communities, disproportionately affected by systemic barriers, make up a large portion of the homeless population. These individuals often face racism, discrimination, and a lack of targeted support, making it even harder to break the cycle of homelessness. Although Calgary is home to several shelters and outreach programs, the demand for these services far exceeds their capacity. Shelters are overcrowded, and long-term solutions are in short supply. While the city has taken steps to address the crisis, including initiatives to provide affordable housing, these efforts have been slow to make a meaningful impact. Calgary's homelessness crisis serves as a powerful reminder that even cities with wealth and opportunity are not immune to this nationwide issue. Montreal, Quebec, known for its rich history, vibrant culture, and thriving arts scene, is also battling a growing homelessness crisis. Over 3,000 people are estimated to be homeless in Montreal, and this number continues to climb. What sets Montreal's crisis apart is the sheer diversity of those affected. From individuals struggling with mental health issues to elderly citizens who can no longer afford stable housing. The root causes of homelessness in Montreal are similar to those in other cities. Rising rents, economic inequality, and a lack of affordable housing. However, Montreal also faces a unique challenge with hidden homelessness. Many individuals are not counted in official statistics because they are couch surfing, living in overcrowded shelters, or staying in squats. These people live in a constant state of instability, moving from place to place without any sense of security or permanence. Another alarming trend in Montreal is the rise in elderly homelessness. As the city's population ages, more and more seniors are finding themselves without housing due to inadequate pensions, fixed incomes, and a lack of affordable options. These individuals are particularly vulnerable during Montreal's harsh winters, where temperatures can drop to life-threatening levels. Without proper shelter, even a single cold night can be deadly. Montreal's local organizations and city government are working hard to combat the issue, but the resources available are nowhere near enough to meet the growing demand. Shelters are frequently overcrowded, and temporary housing programs often fail to provide long-term stability. Despite these efforts, the crisis continues to worsen, leaving thousands of people struggling to survive in a city celebrated for its creativity and innovation. Calgary and Montreal may seem like vastly different cities, but they are united by a common struggle. The homelessness crisis in both places highlights the deep systemic issues affecting communities across Canada. From economic instability to systemic inequality, the causes are complex, and the solutions require urgent action. These stories remind us that homelessness is not just about housing. It's about people, their challenges, and their resilience. The question remains, how long can we allow this crisis to grow before taking meaningful steps to address it? Did you know that some of Canada's most vibrant and affluent cities are grappling with homelessness crises of unprecedented scale? This issue is not limited to smaller or struggling regions. Even the country's most iconic urban centers are failing to provide basic shelter for thousands of people. The crisis is growing year after year, driven by skyrocketing housing costs, mental health challenges, and a lack of systemic support. Today, we'll explore two of the cities hardest hit by this epidemic, Vancouver and Toronto, and reveal the heartbreaking realities behind the numbers. Vancouver, British Columbia, known worldwide for its stunning natural beauty, thriving cultural scene, and reputation as one of Canada's most desirable cities to live in, is at the epicenter of the homelessness crisis. Over 2,000 people are estimated to be living on the streets or in temporary shelters. But the real number is likely much higher. The visible homelessness in Vancouver is stark. From sprawling tent cities in public parks to makeshift shelters under highways, the crisis is impossible to ignore. One of the primary drivers of homelessness in Vancouver is its astronomical housing costs. Vancouver's real estate market is among the most expensive in the world, and the gap between housing prices and income levels is growing wider every year. For low-income earners, finding affordable housing is virtually impossible, and even middle-income families are increasingly at risk of being priced out. The result is thousands of people, including seniors, families, and youth, who are forced to live without stable housing. But the problem in Vancouver extends beyond housing costs. Many of the city's homeless population face significant barriers such as mental health struggles, addiction issues, and limited access to support services. The opioid crisis has hit Vancouver particularly hard, further exacerbating the challenges for those already vulnerable. Shelters and outreach programs, though plentiful, are overwhelmed, leaving many without access to the help they desperately need. For a city often seen as a beacon of prosperity, Vancouver's homelessness crisis serves as a grim reminder of how inequality and systemic failures can affect even the wealthiest regions. Toronto, Ontario, Canada's largest city and its economic powerhouse, faces an even larger homelessness crisis. With over 8,000 people currently without stable housing, Toronto is at the forefront of this growing epidemic. The sheer scale of the problem is staggering, with the city's shelters often operating at or beyond capacity. The homelessness crisis in Toronto is not just about numbers. It's about the human cost of a system that has left too many people behind. The root causes of homelessness in Toronto are multifaceted. Skyrocketing housing prices and a lack of affordable rental units are major contributors. Toronto has one of the most expensive housing markets in Canada, and for many residents, keeping up with rent has become an impossible task. Even working individuals and families find themselves unable to afford shelter, forcing them into overcrowded shelters or, worse, onto the streets. Toronto's homeless population also includes a growing number of vulnerable groups, such as single mothers, racialized communities, and individuals struggling with mental health issues or addiction. The city's mental health services are stretched thin, leaving many without the care they need to recover and rebuild their lives. Addiction, particularly to opioids, is another significant factor, further compounding the challenges faced by those on the streets. While Toronto has implemented numerous programs to address homelessness, including emergency shelters and affordable housing,